He's with us. He'll never leave us. He'll never forsake us. We're going to be reminded of that today. Daniel chapter 3. If you have your Bible, go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 3. One of the most powerful and yet profound stories in all of the Bible. And each time that I read this, I learn something new. And most of you probably know that Daniel was a prophet, and he had some really strange dreams. And I don't know what all those dreams meant, but there's a lot of truth in this book. And Daniel, he was born around 721-ish BC, and he was exiled into Babylon around 605. A faithful man of God. And you know the story, but he was favored by the king, Nebuchadnezzar, an evil king, narcissistic king, megalomaniac. I mean, this guy was all about power and control, and he was an administrative counselor to the king, pretty much. But he did not compromise his faith. He was a man of character, and Daniel was a man of conviction. But it's really interesting because Daniel, he was forced to speak the Chaldean language. And he was forced to read the Chaldean literature. And he acclimated to the community and the culture, but he never compromised his character. He always stood on biblical conviction. Now, Daniel 3, we're not really sure where Daniel is, but we know that Daniel, he mentored 3 guys, and they were actually renamed, and Daniel was renamed. Did y'all know Daniel was renamed when he was in the Babylonian Empire? They renamed him to Belteshazzar, which meant Prince of Baal. But, well, you can call me whatever you want to. I know who I really am. He was renamed. I mean, there were temptations all around him. And so these other 3 guys, they were mentored by Daniel, and we know these guys. We grew up in Sunday school. We heard the story. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Who knows? Abednego. All right. So I want to talk to you today about a message entitled, How to Have Faith in the Midst of the Fire. How to have faith in the midst of the fire. And how many of you know that we are living in the culture of Babylon? We're in the fire. And there are counterfeit kingdoms, and there are counterfeit kings, and here we are. How do we respond? Well, Daniel chapter 3 gives us 3 truths regarding living life in the furnace. 3 truths regarding living life in the furnace. So Daniel chapter 3, we're going to start in verse 3. The first thing we got to realize is, number 1, we must exhibit fortitude. We must exhibit fortitude. Look at verse 3 in chapter 3. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they knew this crossed the line. This was the biggest line. This was the first of all 10 commandments. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. This is the line. Now Neb, he created, get this, a 90-foot golden statue of himself. 90 feet. Now think about the cross at Pittsburgh. That That was how monumental this statue was. Why would Neb do that? That's a great question. Why would he do that? Why would North Korea's Kim Jong-un force people to bow down to him? Why would he do that? Why would the president of Turkmenistan put golden statues in the streets of himself? Why did Saddam Hussein create a statue of himself? Easy. They wanted to resurrect Babylon and become the new Babylonian empire. Now, you say, well, really? Well, we know Hussein wanted to be the new Nebuchadnezzar, but here's the reality. Look, Nebuchadnezzar's heart is everybody's heart. It's everybody's heart until God changes that heart. So congratulations. You got Neb's heart. You want to be in control. You want to rule and reign over your family and your friends and your boss and your job. You have Nebuchadnezzar's heart. Now in Daniel 3, the worship service starts, the drum beat hits, and the preacher gets up to do the welcome. Verse 4, the herald proclaimed aloud. This is the false preacher. All right, this is the false preacher. This is what he said. You are commanded, O peoples, nations and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the cowbells, I just added that part. But you know, they're the instrument of the devil. The lyre, the trigon, I don't even know what the trigon is. Ask Laura, she's a professional. The harp, the bagpipe, every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. They had a counterfeit praise band, had 6 instruments, worshiping a statue 6 cubits by 60 cubits. That's a lot of 6s, pointing to an anti-God kingdom. And then the herald continues with a threat. Look at verse 6. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. Why would there be a furnace nearby? I mean, it's just like randomly a furnace there. What we know is that to melt gold, you have to have a furnace, get this, that is at least 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So the very instrument that created this 90-foot statue and melted the gold was the instrument by which threatened people who did not worship this statue. So the text continues, verse 7. Therefore, as soon as all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. This is worship by coercion. This is worship by compulsion. This is not worship by cheer. This is not worship by a sense of consent of the people. They were coerced. Now, I can't imagine the scene. I can't. The only depiction I can imagine is a stadium full of people that are all shouting in unison. Now, me and Satch, we went to the Ole Miss game last night, and most of you know that we have a Babylonian chant called Hotty Toddy, and there are some 70,000 people in the stands. Now, most biblical commentators say that in Daniel 3, there were some 300,000. 300,000 people shouting praise and worship and laying prostrate on the ground to a false and fake God. That's pressure. 299,996 people fell face down in worship. Now, can you imagine how lonely those three guys were? It's a lot worse than being a Furman fan at Ole Miss game. You're talking about lonely. But listen, students particularly, hear me out. Hear me out. They didn't bow, they didn't bend, and they didn't budge. You know why? Because there's something that I think we miss sometimes, particularly if you're in school. So I want you to hear this. Sometimes the result of godliness is loneliness. Sometimes that even though we're lonely doesn't mean that we're not godly. Godliness and loneliness can coincide. And sometimes the right thing to do is actually the hardest thing to do. You know why they couldn't bow to this fake God? They wouldn't bow their knee to the gold because they had already bowed their knee to the one true living God. They couldn't bow to this fake God. And then the false preacher, just in case the 300,000 people couldn't hear, he's going to tell us the rules again in verse 11. Whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. Hey, just in case those in the back can't hear, I know you may not be able to hear a lot of people within the sound of my voice. Just in case, these are the rules. And then he sees in the distance, in the very back, three guys. Not going to bend, not going to bow, not going to budge. Not my God. You know why? Listen, it's so important. Because they had a greater sense of fear and humility of the one true living God than the fake God and King Nebuchadnezzar. I'll do anything, but I won't bow, I won't bend, and I will not budge. Look, when we see this text, as it continues, verse 12, two words come to mind. I want us to read verse 12. There are certain Jews, he saw the guy standing, whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. You know what words come to mind? Two words that come to mind when I see this story? Two powerful words. Students, particularly if you're in school, hear me out. You ready? Two words. Peer pressure. Peer pressure. Now, that's not just for kids. That's not just for students. That's for adults. Peer pressure. Everybody else is doing it. Look around. It can't be that wrong. Everybody else is doing it. Maybe I can bow externally and not bow internally. They never compromised, church. They didn't compromise. Listen, will you bend under pressure is the question. Will you bend under pressure or stand on principle? One or the other. No in between. You going to bend under pressure or you going to stand on principles? When everybody else, all the friends are going to the party, when all my friends are cheating, when all my friends are involved in risky behavior, you gonna bend to pressure? Or you gonna stand on principle? Take a stand on principle. Are you making decisions from the outer pressures of the world or the inner principle of the Word? That's the question. That's the pressure. After our pressures, God's after our principle. Now watch this. You will only overcome, listen, you will only overcome temptation when your inner principle is greater than your outward pressure. You hear that? That's the only way you'll overcome temptation. When your inner principle is greater than your outward pressure. That's good stuff. All right, number one, we must exhibit fortitude. Number two, we must execute faithfulness. We We must execute faithfulness. Look at verse 13. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. He's enraged, full of wrath and anger. He wants the boiling of his soul to be felt in the burning of their body. So they brought these men before the king. Verse 14. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image I have set up? Now, if you're ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I've made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. And who is this God whom will deliver you out of my hands?" So what did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego do at this point? Can I tell you what they didn't do? They didn't hold a business meeting and say, "Hey, look, we need to huddle up. We need to vote. Can we still bow and bend externally but not internally?" They didn't do that. They didn't form a committee. They didn't, they didn't even pray. You know why? Because you don't have to pray about what you already know is right. They already knew. Listen to what happened. They didn't bend, they didn't budge. Look at verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. We ain't bowing, we ain't budging, we ain't bending." Verse 17. "If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king." Now, here's what we need to know about this confident statement. They embraced and accepted that deliverance may not necessarily mean that they would make it through the furnace. They embraced any and every deliverance because it was a win-win situation. Because again, they had a greater fear of God than they had of the gold. And if they didn't make it through the furnace, guess what? They're with God forever. It was a win-win situation. And so just because God is able does not necessarily mean that he will deliver us from the furnace, but if he doesn't, we'll be with him anyway. I love that. Now here's the way I wrote that thought. Our God can do everything, but we cannot make him do anything. We can't. Contrary to some people, you cannot execute enough faith as though it's energy to force and coerce God to do anything. And so we see some of the most powerful words in all of Scripture. God will deliver us out of your hand, O King. And if you don't get anything in this sermon today, I want you to catch these next three words. Verse 18. Some of the most powerful words. But if not. But if not. Be it known to you, O King, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up. This, church, is the measure of true faith. But if not. This, church, is the anthem of biblical faithfulness. Even if God doesn't deliver us, we will serve him. He's worthy. And let me just ask you this regarding your prayer life. Let me ask you this. Do your prayers only petition the hand of God, or do they pursue the heart of God? One thing I know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they pursued the heart of God. even when the hand of God may or may not join the cause. So I wondered this morning if we could say that our faith is a but if not clause. Does it have a but if not clause on it, our faith? Yesterday afternoon, we had the funeral of Miss Sandra Norman. And you know what comes to mind when I think of Sandra? A but if not faith. But if not, I'm going to stand on Jesus. I can 100% tell you that her faith had this clause on it. But if not. Now, can God deliver you from the health crisis? Absolutely. But if not, can God deliver you from the trial? But if not, can God deliver you through the marital struggle? But if not. Here's what these guys were saying. God, I pray we escape. But if not, I pray we can endure. I pray we can endure. Why in the world would they maintain so much faith in a God that would not deliver them? Why would they do that? You mean they would worship a God that would allow them to burn in a fiery furnace? Can I tell you something? Here's what these guys know. Hell on earth is much easier to walk through than hell in eternity. Whew. We got to hear that, church. And if you're a believer in Jesus today, you're going to spend eternity with Jesus forever. You're the closest to hell you'll ever be right now. That's good news. But I got bad news for those who don't believe in Jesus. You're the closest to heaven you'll ever be until you trust Christ. And they understood that, hey, it doesn't matter what happens to me here on this earth because I know where I'm going to be eternally. But if not, the choice is clear. They didn't budge, didn't bow. Now the question, will they burn? Got to exhibit fortitude, execute faithfulness, and lastly, we must experience fellowship. We must experience fellowship. Look at verse 19. And Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury. The expression on his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. Turn up the heat, guys. I'll make sure this does its job. Verse 20. He ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, cast them into the burning fiery furnace. These were the guys that nobody would mess with. They could manhandle anybody. Verse 21. These men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Now listen to how hot this furnace was. Because the king's order was urgent and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men. That's Nebuchadnezzar's mighty meatheads. Those men, and took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. Now, this is so fascinating. So much happened right here. Something really interesting, by the way, happened. These men, they're thrown into the furnace, and nothing, not even the hair on their head burns. The only thing that burns is what bound them. Isn't that fascinating? It's so fascinating. What burned is what bound them. To borrow a phrase from Miss Tilly's Bible, the only thing that bound them outside the fire was burned up inside the fire. Whew. Wow. And the reason that many of us are still bound is because you haven't been refined inside the fire. The same fire the enemy uses to destroy is the fire that God wants to use to refine. We may not be delivered from the fire, but pray God will deliver us through the fire. But that's not the most important part, and that's not the most fascinating part. In fact, notice that the Babylonian linemen, the unbelievers, the meatheads, they were the ones who died in the fire, not the believers. That's fascinating. But that's not the most fascinating part. Look at verse 24. This is the most fascinating part. King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, bet he was, and rose up in haste. They declared to his counselors, "We did not cast 3 men bound into the fire." They answered and said to the king, "True, O king." He answered and said, "But I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th," listen to this, "is like a son of the gods." I bet he was. I bet he was. Before Nebuchadnezzar, church, before Nebuchadnezzar could get off of his throne, Jesus got off of his throne, stooped down into a situation that nobody wanted to stoop into, and stand with people that nobody wanted to stand with, and he provided deliverance. And that's good news for you, and that's good news for me, because Jesus is in the furnace, he's in the fire with us. It's great news. He's before us, he's beside us, he's behind us, walking with us. Now, let's imagine for a moment in heaven that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego there in heaven, maybe playing pickleball with Jesus, and Jesus looks up and says, "Hey guys, I got a question. When was your faith the greatest? When was your faith the most authentic?" You know what they would say? I know what they would say. Jesus. That's easy. We were thrown into the fire, and you were with us. So let me just encourage you, church. It's my experience. The times that our faith grows the most is when we have faith in the fire. That's when our faith grows the most. I don't know about you, but it's in those times where I feel closest with Jesus. And so let me just kind of wrap up with some concluding thoughts. This story is not just about what God did 2,500 years ago. It's not. This is a record about what God is doing today. And he wants to deliver you. I remember as a high school senior, the whole country, we were torn apart by the events that happened that were unspeakable at Columbine High School. And I remember reading about the story of Cassie Bernal and Rachel Scott. They had committed their life to Christ at a youth camp in 1997. And in fact, Rachel dreamed of being a Christian missionary. She was loved by all of her friends at school, and she loved her church. On April the 20th, 1999, 11:19 a.m., they were faced with the greatest pressure you could ever be faced with. And in that moment, Eric Harris held up a gun, and he asked those 2 girls, "Do you believe in God?" They didn't bow, they didn't bend, they didn't budge. They said, "Yes, I do." And he pulled the trigger. And they perished in the hallways of Columbine High School. You say, why would God allow that? Why wouldn't he deliver those who are faithful? Listen, these girls knew something. What Jesus did for us, believers, it's greater than even what he did for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You say, what do you mean? Jesus was with them in the fire. Listen, Jesus went into the fire so that we didn't have to. He came to rescue us from a situation we could not rescue ourselves. And he endured the wrath that was reserved for you and for me. These girls knew. These girls knew. It's a win-win. But if not. But if not. Do you have that faith? Because that's the faith that we got to have in the midst of the fire. Can you pray with me? With heads bowed, with eyes closed this morning,